Just one more. Oh. Would you by chance have any water? You must have water. You don't have any. Oh. All right. You'll have to forgive me, you see. I've been traveling for many days across the desert, all the while with the sun beating down on me. That's how I got this blister. But actually, I'm starting to feel much better now. Enough about me. Let's get on with our story. I'd like to share the story of Rapunzel. Give me a moment, and I'll relate the events of this tale. Oh, boy. It's so much cooler here. This is much better. And as I mentioned, I'd like to tell you the story of Rapunzel. Our story takes place long ago in a land that was most beautiful. There were hills and green forests and streams, and the fields were well watered. And just about right over there was a castle that was surrounded by a moat, and within the walls of the castle lived a witch. All who lived in the land lived there in great fear of this witch, and it was told that she was able to grow the biggest and the best and the most finest vegetables in the valley. Now, of course, no one dared to steal the fruits and vegetables that grew in her garden, yet nearby there lived a young couple who had recently been married. And at first they had not been able to have any children, but by this time the woman had conceived, and they looked forward to soon having a new baby to bless their home. One lovely day they decided to go for a walk and ventured near the moat that surrounded the witch's castle. They crossed the moat and spied a row of cabbage growing firm and round. The woman's mouth began to water. She decided that she simply had to have cabbage that very night for dinner. She turned to her husband and said, "Oh, please, dear husband, it has been such a terribly long time since I've had any cabbage. Won't you please pick a head of it for me? Though it truly belongs to the witch, no one will know that we have taken it, and no one will be the wiser for it." Now understand, her husband was a soft-hearted fellow who cherished his wife, and he willingly scaled the wall and went into the garden, carefully surveying the new surroundings. He cautiously took a head of cabbage and returned to his wife, and they took their treasure home. She cut up the cabbage and made a delicious salad with a thick, rich dressing to pour over it. She was very pleased with the meal that she had prepared and enjoyed her feast immensely. She was so taken in with the cabbage that she suggested to her husband that he venture into the garden again on the morrow and steal another head from the witch. Arising very early the next day, just as the eastern sky was beginning to grow light, the husband went and took another head of cabbage. Immediately his fears were realized. There, standing before him, was the witch, and she demanded,
"What is the meaning of this?"
You don't understand," he replied. "Cabbage is my wife's most favorite vegetable. Surely you don't mind sharing from your garden?"
"That is where you are wrong. You have taken it from me without asking my approval. On the very same day that your daughter is born, you will give her to me."
"But my wife is due to deliver any time." After he arrived home, he told his wife about what had happened, and she was very depressed, as one might imagine. Soon, their first child was born, a darling little girl with blonde curly hair, and as they sat admiring her, the witch suddenly appeared in the room and demanded that the child be given into her custody. With tear-filled eyes, the young couple handed over their sweet baby girl to the evil witch. "We were going to call her Julie," said her father.
"No, because you have taken from me those things which were not yours. She shall be called Rapunzel."
Then the wicked woman left, leaving the grieving parents simply to console one another. The witch looked after Rapunzel, watched her grow, kept her fed and clothed and cared for most of her needs. As the years passed, when Rapunzel reached her 12th birthday, the witch took her far, far away and placed her in a very tall tower overlooking a field. Rapunzel couldn't imagine what was going on. Why was she being treated like this, she wondered.
You must stay here and keep yourself amused and just enjoy yourself. Maybe you can just sing to yourself, said the witch.
The witch left and took the ladder which they had used to climb into the tower with her. It was going to be impossible for Rapunzel to get down. Years and years went by, and Rapunzel's hair grew and grew, and it became longer and longer still. And when it had been nearly 12 years since she'd been in the tower, she sat down and began to braid her very long hair to where it looked something like this. It took her quite a long time to braid so much hair, but eventually she finished. And after so many years that it had to grow, when she let her hair down out of the window of the tower, it reached the ground. The wretched witch had since made it a habit to come by daily in the morning and call up to her stepdaughter and say, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair that I may climb up and visit you." And when she heard the witch, she would throw down her long locks of hair. The witch would take hold of Rapunzel's hair and climb and pull herself up into the tower.
How wonderful it is for you to have hair as long as to make it so that I can come up and visit with you again.
Every so often, nearly every day, the witch would come by and repeat her request, and once again Rapunzel would throw down her hair. One fine day, a noble prince, the king's son, rode out of his castle on a large, beautiful white stallion. He had been out overseeing the land that would surely be his when he became the king. It so happened that Rapunzel was singing at the particular time that the prince rode by. Never in his entire life had he heard such a beautiful voice. He could not figure out just where the lovely music was coming from. With determination, he approached the tower to see whether the music was coming from the window above. Such beautiful, beautiful music. And there in the tower, of course, sat Rapunzel, singing to herself, and she had a voice of an angel. Well, the prince heard it again and listened some more and approached the tower. He dismounted from his horse and examined the tower. There were no stairs and no ladder, and there was no door. In fact, no way that a person could get into the tower at all. He couldn't see the face of the woman that sang so beautifully. In fact, he couldn't see anyone. He contented himself by sitting back and just listening to the music until it was time for him to return to the palace at night. From time to time, he'd stop by and visit the tower just to hear the nameless, faceless, beautiful voice. On one particular visit through the forest, the prince got off his horse and sat back to enjoy the music as he often had. On that particular day, as he sat watching, much to his amazement, the witch appeared as if from nowhere. As she approached the tower, she screeched out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And as quickly as she had said it, rope-like braids of Rapunzel's hair came tumbling down out of the window of the tower down to the ground, and the witch seized hold of the braids and with some effort made her way to the top and crawled in through the window, and just as quickly the braids disappeared. Now, you can well imagine the amazement of the prince. He could scarcely believe what he had just witnessed. How could a maiden have such long hair? And to think that one could make their way into a tower by climbing braids. Well, the witch made her way down out of the tower on Rapunzel's hair and left. Our determined prince concluded that it was always somewhere before noon that the witch made her visits. And since he had never seen her during the afternoon, he surmised that he might very well be able to visit with the maiden during the afternoon without fear of being interrupted. Well, the next morning the prince made his way to the tower to feast his ears on Rapunzel's lovely melodies. She was, without a doubt, the finest singer he had ever heard. While he rode toward the tower, he anticipated their meeting, and looking around and seeing that no one was there, he shouted just as the witch had.
"Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair."
And just as he had hoped, Rapunzel's braided hair tumbled down before him. Her hair was as fragrant as a spring bouquet of flowers. Oh, it was so lovely, and he was so excited to see them. And he took hold, and briskly he made his way up the outside of the tower and into the chamber where Rapunzel had dwelled these past 12 years. She was nearly frightened to death and backed against the wall.
"Please, don't be afraid, for lo, you are the most beautiful maiden I have ever seen, and your voice is most lovely and pleasant to listen to. Daily I have come to hear you sing."
Rapunzel had never seen a man before, but she recognized that he meant no harm to her, and his words were kind. The prince proposed that they be married, and delightedly she said yes, because she knew that the prince would surely treat her better than the witch had these past many years. Now they excitedly set about making their wedding plans. But first, there was the dilemma of how they could both climb down from out of the tower. If she let down her hair, the prince could climb down, but she would be stuck, as she always had been. Rapunzel suggested that the prince continue his visits, and that each time he bring with him a bit of silk or clothing, and then when there was sufficient to be tied together to make a rope, Rapunzel could climb down, and at last they could fulfill their dream and ride off back to the palace and be married. In the meantime, the witch continued her visits as she always had, and she would call up to Rapunzel and have her throw down her hair that she could climb up and visit the maiden. And Rapunzel looked forward to this and knew when the witch would come and she would let down her hair. The witch would take hold and climb to the top. But one day, Rapunzel made the tragic mistake of noting how it was that the witch was now growing very old, and that she was no longer able to make her way into the window as easily as she once had, and she tired rather quickly. "Why, compared to the prince," she said, "you're quite slow." Well, the witch was nothing short of outraged, and with that Rapunzel had to admit that she had done wrong in letting the prince come in, and willingly accepted her punishment. In an instant, the witch took and cut off Rapunzel's long, beautiful braids, and tying them into the end of the bed, threw them out the window, and together they climbed down from out of the tower's chamber. Slowly the two of them made their way across the country and journeyed into another land, into a country far, far away. The witch was not to be fooled. She left Rapunzel in the barren wasteland and hastened to make her return to the tower. And arriving there, knowing that the prince would come and soon be on his way, she climbed up the outside, and tying the two braids together, she pulled them in from off the ground and sat and waited for the prince's return. The prince, meanwhile, was journeying toward the tower to finally free his bride-to-be. He was nearly beside himself with excitement. He bounded off his horse. Looking up to the tower, he shouted up to Rapunzel, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And within the tower, the deceitful old witch let the braids tumble to the ground. Of course, the prince couldn't see the witch inside, and bounded up the outside of the tower and climbed in. He was greeted with a cold, icy stare.
Trying to escape with Rapunzel, are you? Well, I'll teach you a lesson. She is not here, and you will never marry her.
And with that, she raised her arms and pronounced a wicked spell. With all of her strength, she zapped him. With such force, he flew right out the window and landed on the grass below. Now, when he recovered, he stumbled along and found that he was now blind. Yet, still he was undaunted, and gradually he continued to make his way along, his heart broken, as all of his hopes had been dashed in the instant he had been struck blind by the witch. Hungry, he continued on his hands and knees, stumbling from tree to tree, making his way along. He did not know how to go or even where to go and where the palace was. He was able to survive only by eating berries and nuts that he came across on the ground. Well, as time and days went by, the prince had nearly given up hope of ever returning to his home or of ever finding his dear maiden. Then, to his surprise, he was sure that he heard Rapunzel's voice. But where could it be coming from, he wondered. It seemed to be coming from the nearby wasteland. Now, of course, he had a lot of difficulty making his way along, yet he struggled ahead to find the source of the voice, and there sat Rapunzel singing. Her tune was a sad song, for she missed her prince dearly, and it had been a long while since she had seen him. The prince, as he approached her, made his way along, and she turned and saw her true love, and with a shout, she jumped up, and he yelled, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel!" And running, they ran and embraced one another and held each other for a long, long while. Soon she noticed that something was wrong. "You cannot see." And the prince explained how the witch had cast a spell on him that had left him blind. And she cradled his head, and she sat and wept, and as the tears from her eyes fell on the prince's face, when next he opened his eyes, he realized that yes, he could see again. It was as though the tears had healed him of his blindness. They embraced and kissed once more and set about once again making plans to be married. They returned to the palace where Rapunzel was introduced to the prince's father, the king, and there they lived happily